Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to chapter 11 of our Understanding International Relations lectures. The last chapter of our survey of the historical evolution of the discipline since its creation some 100 years ago. We will have a look today at the revival of realist theories after the 9/11 attacks for some 20 years. In other words, the revival of realism, and more specifically the success of so-called power cycle theory, and also of the neoclassical realist approach. The link between 9/11 and the success of said realist theories is an indirect link, a chronological one, a correlation, to put it differently, rather than a causal link. We'll come back to this immediately. So we saw last week, ladies and gentlemen, that the peaceful end of the Cold War had permitted liberalism to triumph in the discipline of international relations. The peaceful end of the Cold War indeed had refuted to some extent the pessimistic analysis of the realists, according to which power politics takes place in anarchy, synonymous with a never-ending state of war, where wars are always possible. No war broke out between the Soviets and the Americans, and the Cold War came to an end which absolutely nobody had anticipated. And thanks to America winning the Cold War, and America being a liberal democracy, liberal theories were successful throughout the 90s. We saw the so-called democratic peace theory, and also Andrew Moravcik's new liberal approach of international politics. So this success of liberal theory is reflected in the discipline. The world political hegemony of the US, the world political preeminence of the United States, both a material and an ideational or ideological or normative preeminence of the US. And this preeminence lasted throughout the 1990s. That is to say, it was acknowledged almost by everybody during the first post-Cold War decade. Things started to change with and after 9/11, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. These attacks indeed inaugurated what we may call a transition period, which is still going on nowadays, 20 years after the attacks. Transition period, why? Because though the US is still prevailing, materially speaking, to some extent normatively speaking too, we'll come back to this. This hegemony is no longer that acknowledged by everybody. More and more actors, be they states or non-state actors, somehow refuse America's preeminence. And of course, the major non-state actor that refused America's preeminence and that challenged America's preeminence was, of course, Al-Qaeda, the author of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. We can add similar terrorist networks, notably the Islamic State. Being non-state actors, these terrorist networks somehow corroborate an approach that we saw in our chapter 6, the transnationalist approach. According to transnationalists, Kieran and Nye, beginning of their career, Rosenau, according to these theorists, non-state actors are at least as important as states. And non-state actors include not merely non-governmental organizations or multinational firms or skillful individuals, but also terrorist or criminal networks. And in a world characterized by interdependence, by globalization, the capacity of these actors to bypass the state's sovereignty, to challenge the state's security is possible. And this exactly is what happened during the 9/11 attacks. Capacity proved that Al-Qaeda was capable of organizing and staging an attack that killed some 3,000 people. Indicates that indeed non-state actors are powerful. They are able to bypass regulation, established by states. They are able to affect the state's foreign policies, even the major powers' foreign policy. Without the 9/11 attacks, the US probably would never have launched Operation Enduring Freedom against the Taliban, and all the more so it would not have launched Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein in 2003. So 9/11 was a very spectacular attack. It was definitely shocking, as proven by the following short movie that shows us how events unfolded on 9/11.
American 11, are you trying to call?
The cockpit is not answering their phone. Our number 1 has been staffed, and our 5 has been staffed.
I am going to call from Washington. I am in a situation with American 11, a possible hijack.
What's going on, Betty? The aircraft is erratic again. Problem, very erratic. Betty, talk to me. Betty, are you there? Betty? Betty?
A plane just what? 737?
What?
Like the World Trade Center.
Who are you talking to?
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
United 175, New York. We have some problems over here right now. We might have a hijack over here, 2 of them.
Jules, this is Ryan. Lives on an airplane that's been hijacked. If things don't go well, and it's not looking good, I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. So happy to find. Same to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you, and I'll see you later. Bye, babe.
What are those people going to do? All the elevators are blocked out.
Oh my God, so both towers are now.
Okay, now I got an aircraft 6 miles east of the White House.
Crystal City, just north of Crystal City.
Just to the north of your town.
Yeah, stop all departures.
Pentagon just got hit. No Preeminence. God damn it, I can't even protect my NCA.
United 93, that traffic for you is 1 o'clock, 12 miles eastbound 370.
Negative contact, we're looking United 93.
United 93, Cleveland, if you hear the center ident.
I got the pistol down. Keep remaining steady. You have the ball board.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
We're 56865. We have, I believe it is a Boeing 757. Can you see him up there, sir?
That's confirmed. It looks like he's rocking his wings.
Roger.
He's rocking back and forth.
We're 56865. I advise you stay away from that aircraft. Go north as fast as you can.
United 93. Have you got information on that yet?
Yeah, he's down.
He's down?
Yes.
When did he land?
He did not land.
Oh, he's down?
Yeah, somewhere up northeast of Camp David.
Sean, it's me. I just want to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. There's lots of smoke, and I just wanted you to know that I love you always.
At number 2 World Trade Center, right. Ladies and students in this office, we're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
I'm on the 83rd floor. I'm gonna die, aren't I? No. Say I'm gonna die.
Ma'am, say your prayers. We're gonna think positive because you gotta help each other get off the floor.
I'm gonna die.
A new type of war. That's what it is.
But though being a very spectacular and shocking event, the 9/11 attacks did not have a long-term impact on the discipline of international relations. I think that two major reasons contribute to explain this absence of any impact. First of all, though Al-Qaeda is a non-state actor, it is not really a familiar one. That is to say, a non-state actor with which Western theorists and international relations is a Western and actually an American social science, an American discipline. American theorists or Western theorists can hardly sympathize with such an NGO, with such a non-state actor, sorry. Though Rosenow, I mentioned this in chapter 6, had published one of the chapters of his book, of his books dealt with the tourist and the terrorists. So he acknowledged the importance of terrorists, but terrorist networks are different from NGOs such as Greenpeace or Amnesty International, such as multinational firms, or such as skillful individuals. We could mention nowadays the Swedish Greta Thunberg fighting for environmental protection. This means that international relations as a discipline was uneasy with the terrorist attacks. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 represented what Daniel Philpott called a challenge to the international relations discipline. Why? Because neither realism nor liberalism, nor to some extent transnationalism can account for what happened because of the specificity of this terrorist network. That is to say, the fact that Al-Qaeda was driven and still is driven by a religious faith, and in a secular discipline such as international relations, theorists are uneasy with religion. So maybe unconsciously, they rejected the idea of deepening the origins, the causes, the significance, and the consequences of this attack. So this is the first reason, due to how a discipline works. The second reason is that the majority of international relations scholars did not consider 9/11 to have a long-lasting impact upon world politics. Rightly or wrongly, they claimed that continuity would prevail despite this spectacular, shocking event, at least once the shock was overcome. And the proof, best proof that we can give in this perspective is Kenneth Waltz's publication less than 1 year after the attacks took place in a book edited by Ken Booth and Timothy Dunn. The title of his chapter is the following one: The Continuity of International Politics. And according to Kenneth Waltz, we should wonder how deep and lasting the impact on American policy and international politics of these terrorist attacks will be. Why? Continuity, because according to Kenneth Waltz, the imbalance of the international system will not be impacted, because nuclear weapons will go on being the most important factor on the international scene, and because the terrorist attacks are but one crisis among many others. And he thus comes to the conclusion terrorists contribute to the continuity of international politics. They further trends already in motion. And since all the more so terror is an instrument used by weak actors, in this case Islamist networks, they do not seriously threaten the security of states. Kenneth Waltz, of course, is a state-centric scholar, a realist scholar. Continuity is one of the main assumptions of realism in general. But it so happens, ladies and gentlemen, that somehow he was right. somehow he was right, because the imbalance of the post-Cold War system that prevailed in 2001 and that still is prevailing nowadays gradually is challenged by another power. That is to say, there is a kind of return of great power, politics and great power, a rivalry. China's rise is the long-term process which international relations theorists consider to be the most important process on the way, much more than specific, even shocking events such as the 9/11 attacks. And this then explains the revival of realism in the discipline of international relations. It explains the revival of realism, and more specifically of the two versions of realism. First of all, the power cycle theory, which focuses on the rise and decline of major powers, of the great powers. And the so-called neoclassical realist approach, which proposes a new analysis of concrete foreign policy behavior of states. And I consider that to some extent, the two approaches can be complementary. That is to say, we can use the power cycle theory to account for systemic processes on the international scene, and we can add to this approach the neoclassical theory in order to try to explain the very concrete decisions and actions undertaken by states within this overall dynamic evolution of the world system. So in today's chapter, we will have a look at the two. We'll have a look at these two theories: the power cycle theory and neoclassical realism. Power cycle theory, ladies and gentlemen, was rediscovered in the discipline of international relations more or less recently, but it had been put forward in the past by during the Enlightenment century, notably by the French Montesquieu and the Scottish historian Edward Gibbon. Both analyzed the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. And this approach then was rediscovered as early as in the 50s as regards the discipline of international relations by Organsky in a book called World Politics. It was once again used by the British historian Paul Kennedy in his book published at the eve of the end of the Cold War, The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers, a very successful book because he somehow announced the decline of the US, though he was at least in the short term, in the short run, he was refuted because it was the USSR that collapsed, and not the US. Anyway, very successful book. And very recently, the theory was also applied by Graham Allison. Graham Allison, who had put forward his behaviorist decision-making models in the 1960s. And Graham Allison used this power cycle theory to predict a possible war opposing the US to China in the future. I will also focus on this process, the rise of China and its impact upon America's preeminence, but I will use another theorist, the one I consider to be the most rigorous power cycle theorist, the American Robert Gilpin, who published his book War and Change in World Politics in 1981. That is to say, 2 years after Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics. Given the success of Kenneth Waltz, Gilpin's book was somehow marginalized in the discipline of international relations. But Gilpin took his revenge, if I may use this expression, 10 years later, when the Cold War came to an end. Why? Because his explanation, or his model, his theory, permits to account, to explain, to understand why precisely the Cold War came to an end. Kenneth Waltz had been unable to predict this. And also, all the more so, Robert Gilpin's approach precisely can help us understanding the contemporary American-Chinese rivalry. So let's have a look at Robert Gilpin's version of the power cycle theory. It is called the hegemonic war theory. You sometimes find the expression hegemonic transition theory. It is used by those who combine in a kind of a synthetic way Gilpin's hegemonic war theory and Organsky's and his disciples' hegemonic power transition theory. So hegemonic war, power transition, if you put them together, the expression is hegemonic transition theory. Anyway, Gilpin was a neo-realist. And remember what we saw in our chapter 8, neo-realists were the younger generation of realists influenced by those criticisms that had been made against classical realists, such as Morgenthau. Rawls, we saw this, had been influenced by the behaviorist critique consisting in saying that there is no such thing as a human nature as claimed by Morgenthau, and therefore Kenneth Rawls looked for another explanation, and he found his explanation of power politics in the anarchical structure of international politics. Gilpin will be influenced by the neo-Marxist criticisms against classical realism. That is to say, very concretely, he is influenced by the fact that Marxists acknowledge a very important, very significant importance to the economic factor. And thus, Robert Gilpin accepts to introduce economic resources to better account for world politics, to better account for the evolution over time of the international power configuration. So his theory is much more a dynamic theory than the static theory of balance of power theorists, such as both Rawls and Morgenthau. And Gilpin also published a book dedicated specifically to economy, the political economy of international relations. In this book, he puts forward the somehow realist approach of international political economy. So the starting point of Gilpin being a neo-realist consists, of course, in saying that continuity prevails in international politics. So here he perfectly agrees with all the realists. The fundamental nature of international relations has not changed over the millennia. But when we go on reading the excerpt concerned, we see immediately his added value, his contribution. International relations continue to be a recurring struggle for wealth and power, among independent actors in a state of anarchy. Wealth and power. So states, the state's behavior takes place in an anarchical setting. This is the Rawls's neo-realist claim, so he agrees with Kenneth Rawls. It is anarchy and not human nature, which explains basically why states behave the way they behave. States look for power, so here is closer to Morgenthau's offensive realism than to Rawls's defensive realism. According to Rawls, states first and foremost look for security. Power is a means to an end. According to Gilpin, power is an end in itself. States look for power. They do not satisfy with security. And his third point, then, this is the contribution, his specific contribution, states also look for wealth. That is to say, for economic welfare. And here, then, he is at least indirectly influenced by neo-Marxism. Regarding then his analysis of the international political system, Gilpin claims that though anarchy prevails, his starting point, this anarchical structure does not exclude the possibility of a hierarchical distribution of power resources favorable to one single power. That is to say, he posits that the most important characteristic of at least the contemporary international political system, and this is true for some 2 centuries now, the most important characteristic is the imbalanced distribution of power resources, the one that Kenneth Waltz acknowledged in his article after 9/11, but which he himself excluded in his theory, since he focused on the stability of the bipolar Cold War confrontation. So to some extent, Waltz does contradict himself when acknowledging after the end of the Cold War the existence of a unipolar and imbalanced system. Gilpin does not commit this kind of contradiction. He always, in all his publications, he emphasizes the fact that the system, rather than being either bipolar or multipolar, that is to say balanced, the system actually is likely to be imbalanced, that is to say unipolar, that is to say dominated by one single power. And that the origin of a power's preeminence is the powers concerned economic richness. Some states are economically predominant for the very simple reason that either they were the first to enter the contemporary, the modern growth cycle, economic growth cycle. This was the case for the United Kingdom in the 19th century, the first to enter the Industrial Revolution. Or they were able, of course, to gradually become wealthier and wealthier, richer and richer, and therefore stronger and stronger. This is the case of the US at the latest after World War II. This economic advantage, and this variable is absolutely not taken into account by neither Waltz nor Morgenthau. This economic advantage permits a state to become, after a more or less long period, to become militarily and therefore politically preeminent. There can be no significant military power without a consolidated economic basis. And thanks to this both military and economic preeminence, a state becomes a hegemonic power. That is to say, the power able to establish rules of international behavior which will permit the stability of the system concerned. That is to say, the hegemonic power establishes rules, international institutions, international organizations, which of course will favor its own national interest, but which nevertheless benefits to the majority of the secondary states. And thanks to these rules, the system, which are most of the time respected by most of the states, the system is stable. The system is stable at least as long as the secondary states are satisfied powers, that is to say, states that do benefit from the existing order and that therefore are not tempted to try to change the order, to overthrow the existing hegemonic power. As long then as the dominant power is able to control the greatest amount of power resources in the system, economic and military resources, as long as this is the case, the system will remain stable. Stable in the realist meaning of absence of any risk of a major war opposing major powers among one another. However, according to Gilpin and Hidden, we have the dynamic element of his theory. However, sooner or later, the hegemonic power will decline. It will not decline in absolute terms, but it will decline relatively to the rise of other powers. Secondary powers will rise gradually. Why is this the case? Why is the preeminent hegemonic power doomed to relatively decline? Because of two processes, because of two mechanisms. First of all, the so-called economic law of uneven growth. The economic law of uneven growth. As I said some minutes ago, the preeminent power is economically preeminent because it was the first to enter the cycle of economic growth. Being the first to have entered this cycle, it will also be the first whose growth rate will gradually slow down. The opposite is true for secondary powers. Secondary powers, by definition, entered the growth cycle later, and therefore, when the major powers' growth rate is slowing down, their own growth rate is prospering, is booming, is accelerating. So sooner or later, there will be a kind of a process synonymous with the secondary powers' economic resources coming close to the economic resources of the still preeminent power, which is therefore relatively declining because the gap in economic resources will no longer be that important as at the beginning of the cycle concerned. This is the first reason. Then there is a second mechanism, a strategic one, called the imperial overstretch. The imperial overstretch designates the fact that the preeminent power, the hegemonic power, since it profits from the existing order, it must be ready to maintain the existing order. This is to say, it must be able to intervene militarily in those regions where instability is likely to break out because of the behavior of some regional or local powers who are dissatisfied with the existing order. In order to intervene successfully in these regional crises, the hegemonic power, of course, has to dedicate a fairly important part of its economic richness to military spending. This military spending then will have negative consequences upon the hegemonic power's capacity to improve its economic productivity. So the more then the prevailing power, the hegemonic power, must invest a significant part of its richness in military expenditures, the more it will handicap its economic growth. And this process then will add its effects to the law of uneven growth. That is to say, the secondary powers will profit and they will come even closer to the preeminent powers' economic resources. All the more so, by definition, the secondary powers have no interest in necessarily maintaining the different regional orders where instability is likely to break out. They can dedicate all their richness to reinvest in improving their already existing economic wealth. Over time, thus, ladies and gentlemen, the system will be no more a unipolar. It will be characterized by a kind of parity phase. That is to say, the system will be characterized by one or more than one secondary powers achieving an economic GDP, gross domestic product, reaching a threshold of 80% of the hegemonic power's GDP. When this is the case, the system is no longer unipolar, but it is entering a parity phase. And this parity phase, then, ladies and gentlemen, is likely to become a kind of transition period. Transition period, that is to say, a period between the still existing system and a new one. Because of what? Because of the prospective overtaking of the relatively declining hegemonic power by the quickly rising secondary power. If this secondary power is a dissatisfied state, then there is a risk of war between the growing revisionist dissatisfied power and the still prevailing but relatively declining hegemonic power. The opposite is true when the rising power is a satisfied state. In this case, a peaceful transition is possible. And this is what happened, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the 19th century when Great Britain was prevailing. So Gilpin applies his approach to the past century, to the 19th century. Great Britain was prevailing after Napoleon's defeat in 1815. And the US first, and then Germany matched and actually exceeded Great Britain's economic resources. America, however, was a satisfied power. It was at that time focusing on the Western Hemisphere. It was not interested in challenging Great Britain's preeminence. So the rise of America had no impact upon the stability of the then British order, the Pax Britannica. Germany, however, was a revisionist state, both Imperial Germany before World War I and Nazi Germany after World War I, before World War II. So Germany challenged Great Britain's preeminence because it wanted to become the prevailing power. And therefore, according to Gilpin's approach, First World War II and then First World War I and then World War II broke out. The two wars are considered, and here then we have the explanation of the title or the label given to Gilpin's theory, hegemonic war theory. World War I and World War II form one single hegemonic war. A hegemonic war is a war which, whatever its immediate triggering causes, a hegemonic war is a war which will give birth to a new system, led and organized by a new hegemonic power. And this is exactly what happened after 1945. The cycle of World War I and World War II put an end to the British hegemony because Great Britain had been declining, and it permitted the most powerful ally in the British alliance, in the anti-Nazi alliance, to become the new hegemonic power. That is to say, the US became gradually the preeminent power after 1945. And what did the US do? It organized a new system by establishing new rules of behavior in international institutions, those that are still existing nowadays, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization at the end of the 1990s. So Gilpin, thanks to this approach, can account for the Cold War. And his analysis of the Cold War is very significantly different, both from Kenneth Waltz's analysis or from the English school's analysis in terms of bipolar society. According to Gilpin, the Cold War was stable thanks to what? Thanks to the basically unipolar structure of the Cold War confrontation. Remember that according to Waltz, Cold War was stable thanks to the bipolar distribution of power, also characterized by the nuclear balance of terror. The English school ascribed the stability of the Cold War to what English school theorists call the bipolar society. As I say, there were implicit and even explicit rules that the Americans and the Soviets accepted to respect after establishing the dialogue, notably during the period of détente, entente, and cooperation. According to Gilpin, if the Cold War was stable, actually it was thanks to America's preeminence, the economic preeminence. That is to say, given that he considers economy to be at the origin of a state's military power, the fact for the military distribution of power resources to be balanced was less important than the fact for the economic resources distribution to be imbalanced. In the economic domain, America was by far the preeminent power. Therefore, the system was basically unipolar. The USSR, throughout the Cold War, was basically ultimately a poor power. And this somehow is corroborated by the empirical data that we can find. If we look at the Soviet GDP, it represented 1/5 of America's GDP at the end of World War II in 1945. It amounted to 45% of America's GDP at best. In 1975, as you say, after the oil crisis and America's lost Vietnam War, as you say, during a period where America was disadvantaged, but it never went beyond less than half of America's GDP. And after 1975, actually, the economic basis of the USSR decreased once again. At the eve of the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 80s, America was almost 3 times richer or wealthier, economically speaking, than the USSR. And this then basically can permit us to explain why the USSR collapsed. It could not go on challenging America because economically it was too weak, and this is also what Gorbachev acknowledged. We saw this in the chapter concerned. So since the collapse of the USSR, logically, America is prevailing. America is prevailing, it is preeminent, and this preeminence has been going on for 30 years now. However, sooner or later, if we apply Gilpin's approach, this will not be the case, no more be the case. Why? Because there will be a new challenger. And indeed, this new challenger, ladies and gentlemen, is China. So let's have a look at the contemporary post-Cold War international system, characterized by the American-Chinese rivalry. Nowadays, system, ladies and gentlemen, is unipolar. It still is unipolar. If we look at the 2 major elements composing a state's power, that is to say, the economic resources and the military strength, the military force as measured by the military budget. If we look at the contemporary economic power distribution, what do we see? We see that nowadays China represents a bit less than 3/4 of America's preeminence, of America's economic richness, sorry. A bit less than 75%, that is to say, still under the threshold of 80%, which I mentioned this some minutes ago, means the start of the parity or transition phase. 73% if we compare the American and the Chinese economic richness at the official exchange rate. That is to say, if we use the traditional way to compare GDPs, for some years now, economists adopt a new technique, and they look at what they call purchasing power parity. If we look at purchasing power parity, things are different because for 8 years now, since 2014, the Chinese GDP measured in terms of purchasing power parity exceeds the American GDP, as you can see on the bottom of this slide. But if we use the traditional comparison, America still is economically ahead of China. Militarily speaking, the advantage of the US is much more significant. As regards 2020, the last year of CIPRI's statistics, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's data, in 2020, the American military budget amounted to $778 billion, to be compared to 252 for China. That is to say, the Chinese GDP represents less than, the Chinese military budget, sorry, represents less than 1/3 of America's budget. So a mere look at the existing data proves that both in the economic and in the military domain, America is prevailing, and this means that the contemporary system in 2022 still is unipolar. But the data that we use also permit us to see that this unipolarity, this American hegemony, is no more in 2022 what it used to be 10, 20, and almost 30 years ago. Why? Because if we look at the dynamic evolution over time, what do we see? We see that the Chinese GDP expressed, measured in terms of the official exchange rate of the Chinese currency in American dollars. What do we see? We see that 30 years ago, the Chinese GDP represented less than 7%, of America's richness. It now represents more than 70%. So the long time evolution, of course, is absolutely favorable to China. And if the trend goes on, and there is no reason why this should not be the case, we can expect that very shortly, the Chinese GDP will match and then exceed America's GDP, though not per capita, but regarding the two countries. So China's economic richness will very soon match America's economic richness. Regarding the military forces, things at first sight are different. Why? Because the evolution here over time during the last 30 years, does it show us? It shows us that China dedicates, relatively speaking, a smaller amount of its richness to military expenditures than the Americans. If you look at the data, in 2020, America's military budget represented 3.7% of America's richness, and the Chinese military budget represented 1.7% of the Chinese economic richness. So in absolute terms, given the very impressive economic rise, economic growth of China, in absolute terms, the military budget has been increased very significantly. But in relative terms, that is to say, compared to what China could have done to some extent, China does not dedicate an important part of its richness to military spending. At first sight, ladies and gentlemen, this could be good news for the Americans, of course. But actually, it is not good news for America. It is bad news from an American point of view. Why? Because precisely, if we compare it to the USSR, China does not commit the same mistake as the USSR. Throughout the Cold War, the USSR spent probably an average of 15% of its weak economic richness to military spending. And therefore, it ended up collapsing at the end of the 80s because the contradiction between too important a military budget and too weak an economic basis, this contradiction could not last eternally, of course. The USSR collapsed. China does not commit this mistake. It first consolidates its economic basis. And we can expect that it will, after a delay of 1 or 2 generations, align its military forces and therefore its political ambitions on its economic richness. And the majority of Western experts do think that China's military budget should match or at least come close to the American one in the 2040s, at the latest in 2050. So to sum up, ladies and gentlemen, this approach, this summary of today's international system, if we look at the mere resources, nowadays system is very close to a transition period. The question then that we should ask, if we go on applying Gilpin's model, is this transition period likely to result in a war, in this case, in a hegemonic war between the still prevailing hegemonic US and the quickly rising China? Well, everything will depend from China's degree of satisfaction. And that is to say, how will China's leadership perceive the rise of China relatively to the US? Will it try to profit from its own rise and topple? Will it be eager to topple America's preeminence, as had been the case for Germany in the past, or will it act like the Americans acted when they became economically richer than Great Britain, and nevertheless did not challenge Great Britain's preeminence? Is it possible to try to account for this unknown future? Well, maybe it is possible, ladies and gentlemen. I think that we should try, at least. Thanks to what? Thanks to the neoclassical realist model of foreign policy. Neoclassical realism, ladies and gentlemen, the term was proposed in 1998 by Gideon Rose in an article published in the journal World Politics. The title of the article, Neoclassical Realism and Theories of Foreign Policy. It is a review article where Gideon Rose proposes a critical review of different books that had been published previously, and which, according to him, had in common to propose a kind of a new approach without naming this new approach. And Gideon Rose therefore proposed to sum up their common points in the term neoclassical realism. And ever since then, neoclassical realism has become pretty successful, at least as usual, of course, among realist scholars. And I would say that the most representative neoclassical realist scholars nowadays are two Americans and one Canadian, Stephen Lobel and Naryn Ripsman, he's the Canadian, and Jeffrey Tagliaferro. What is the specificity, ladies and gentlemen, of neoclassical realism? Well, the label used by Gideon Rose permits us to understand immediately neoclassical realists are all at once neo-realists and classical realists. That is to say, they propose a synthetic, eclectic combination, both of the classical realist assumptions of notably Hans Morgenthau, chapter 3, and they combine this classical realism with Kenneth Waltz's neo-realism that we saw in our chapter 8. Very concretely, to understand, to explain, to account for a state's concrete foreign policy decisions and actions. Why did state A do this or that last week, last month, last year, etc.? Why did it not do what we might have expected to do, etc., etc.? Neoclassical realists start from the assumption that the most important, the basic variable, as they call it, the independent variable, explaining a state's behavior, is the systemic distribution of power resources among states. And that is to say, a state's foreign policy is basically determined, or at least shaped, by the place or the rank of a state in the international system. That is to say, the power resources that the state possesses relatively to other states' power resources. So the systemic distribution of power resources is the basic factor, and this is a neo-realist claim. It's not human nature which explains why a state behaves the way it behaves, as claimed by classical realists such as Morgenthau. No, there is no more human nature. It is the power distribution, the power configuration at the system level. A state cannot do what its power resources do not permit it to do, to some extent, even if it would like to. So there is a determination from the system upon the actor when considering what to do or what not to do. This impact, however, is not direct, it is indirect. That is to say, it is filtered through the vision that the statesman of the state concerned has of his state's or her state's power resources, relative power resources. That is to say, once we know the systemic power distribution, and once we therefore know the relative power of one specific state, we have to look at how the statesman of this state perceives this somehow objectively existing power configuration. So we therefore have to look at the statesman. And here then, the neoclassical realists agree with more with those classical realism, claiming, remember, the statesman rationality when defining the national interest, etc., etc. So we look at the statesman and at his perception. How does he perceive the existing objective reality at the system level? And then there is a second. This variable then is called the intervening variable. It is a secondary variable compared to the most important one, which is the independent. It is the intervening variable, and it is the first intervening variable because there is a second intervening variable, that is to say, a statesman, though taking the final decision, may be influenced by the domestic society. A statesman is more or less free, or not, to do what he or she is eager to do, but he has to take into account the reaction of the civil society, of the different individual citizens living in his country, agreeing or not with what he or she would like to do. So, in order to understand why a state does what it does on the international scene, we have also to look at the relations between the statesman and the civil society within the state, which is therefore a kind of internal domestic element pretty close to Moravcik's neoliberal theory. Remember, according to Moravcik, the societal preferences influence a statesman's foreign policy. The approach here is realist and not liberal because neoclassical realists basically reverse the hierarchy between the statesman and the civil society. In Moravcik's approach, the civil society dominates the statesman. In the neoclassical approach, the statesman dominates the civil society. The statesman may be constrained, limited in his or her freedom by the civil society, but the civil society does not impose its will upon the statesman. So the statesman is free to use more or less depending on the importance, the resources possessed by the civil society. So we have a model which permits to explain a state's foreign policy. We start with the international power distribution, then we look at the statesman's perception of his vision and also his objectives, his aims. How does he perceive the existing systemic reality? And then we look at whether he is or not influenced by the civil society, and thus we end up explaining the dependent variable, that is to say, the concrete foreign policy decision or the concrete foreign policy action that the statesman undertakes, will undertake, or did undertake. Let's then apply, ladies and gentlemen, this model to precisely the future of American-Chinese relations. If we look at the independent variable, we saw this up to now, the power configuration at the systemic level in the future will be characterized by more or less parity between the Chinese and the Americans, that is to say, the Chinese economic resources first and military strength soon will be equal to America's resources. So there will be a material parity. This US-Chinese parity, the term parity is used as not balance, ladies and gentlemen. Parity because in the power cycle theory, parity means instability, while conversely, in the balance of power theory of Waltz or of Morgenthau, equality is called balance, and balance means stability. So it's exactly the opposite perception of one and the same reality, equality between two powers, but this equality is a balance for some of them, it is a parity for the other one. So here we have to use the term parity. This parity then, this material parity between the Chinese and the Americans will be interpreted. We look at independent variable number one, will be perceived and interpreted by the American and the Chinese leaders. Imagine the Chinese leaders coming to the conclusion, I am now as strong as the Americans, but the Americans do not want me to be the leader of the world. Chinese leaders then might be tempted to go to war in order to overthrow America. Anti-American leaders may perceive this parity in the following way. China is coming closer and closer and managed to be as rich as the US. We cannot wait anymore. We cannot wait. We cannot afford to wait anymore. We should wage a preventive war in order to stop the Chinese rise, in order to go on, we Americans, to be the preeminent power. If this perception should prevail in the future, ladies and gentlemen, then a hegemonic war is possible. Not necessarily probable, but possible, at least conceivable. This is what happened in 1914 and once again in 1939. Of course, the opposite is possible, all the more so, that is to say, peaceful transition is possible, mainly if we look at intervening variable number two. And here we have first and foremost to look at what happens in China. China, you know, that is a communist regime. That is to say, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party is not constrained by the Chinese civil society. If then China goes on remaining a communist state, then the Chinese leader will be able somehow to act the way he or she is eager to act, the successor of Xi Jinping. If, conversely, China should transform into a more democratic, a more pluralist society because of the rise, or thanks to the rise of a very significant, important middle class, then China being a democracy or becoming a democracy or no longer being an autocracy, then the peaceful transition is not necessarily probably either, but possible, at least once again conceivable for the reasons that we saw last week. The democratic peace theory, democracies do not go to war against one another. So you see that the future of the US-Chinese rivalry is not determined yet. It will depend on the two intervening variables through which the systemic parity between the two major powers will be filtered. So there is no, I would say, deterministic or predetermined outcome of the Chinese-American rivalry, and therefore I'm a bit more skeptical or a bit more optimistic than Graham Allison in his book Destined for War, where he announces that a war between China and the US is much more probable than peace. Anyway, future will tell us what may happen if, I repeat, we apply the neoclassical realist model. This neoclassical realist model, ladies and gentlemen, can meanwhile be applied to account for Putin's decision to go to war against Ukraine. So let's have a look at the very concrete presence of international politics, the Russian-Ukrainian war. How can we account for it if we apply the neoclassical realist model? Let's start with the independent variable. The international system, as I already said, nowadays is synonymous with America's preeminence, but I already said that. I also said that America's preeminence is somehow withering. It's somehow fading away. It is declining, etc. At the world political system, and to some extent, this is proven, corroborated empirically by Trump's trade war against China, which tends to prove that America is scared by China's economic dynamism. This withering hegemony is somehow corroborated empirically by the decision of Joe Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan. We can no longer go on spending too much money in fighting local wars and trying to proceed to state building in Afghanistan, where state building will never work. And Biden actually justified this decision by America's necessity to cope with China. So the system is characterized by America's decline, relative decline, and regarding no more the world system, but the regional system. Russia is preeminent in its region, of course. There is no serious rival in the immediate neighborhood of Russia. This objective, systemic, and subsystemic reality is analyzed by the Russian decision maker, Vladimir Putin. And we can posit that Putin considered this objective reality to offer to Russia a window of opportunity. Since he's eager either to dominate politically, to control politically Ukraine, and or to conquer Ukraine, or at least a part of Ukraine, the southeastern part of Ukraine, he can come to the conclusion there is a window of opportunity because of America's decline and because of my own preeminence in the region. If we look at the intervening variable number 2, ladies and gentlemen, what do we see? Well, we see that Vladimir Putin, of course, is not constrained by neither his administration nor any kind of Russian civil society. His power is extremely personalized, autocratic, to put it differently. He's free to do what he aims at doing. And this then permits us to understand why he ordered the Russian army to invade Ukraine. Thanks to the neoclassical realist model, ladies and gentlemen, we does have a possible explanation of why Russia invaded Ukraine. If we look at the different variables, this permits us to have a kind of a coherent explanation, which does not mean, ladies and gentlemen, that it's the only explanation possible, nor does it mean that it is the best one compared to other possible ones, or a good one even, of course. And I thus, ladies and gentlemen, come to the very last point of today's lecture, and also of all my lectures on understanding international relations. The utility of international relations theories. I was supposed to dedicate a full chapter to this topic, chapter 12. If you look at the syllabus, for different reasons, I am unable to do so, so I will very quickly, in 2 or 3 minutes, mention this dimension here, thanks to the concrete example that I gave, the application of the neoclassical realist model to account for very concrete, very empirical events such as Russia's war in Ukraine. What is the utility, the usefulness of international relations theories? International relations, what for? That's the question that many students ask. And my answer will be very straight and very simple. Well, international relations theories permit us to better understand international political processes, international political events, international political trends. This is my conception of why we should use international relations. International relations as a discipline, that is true, I would say, for social sciences in general, cannot predict what may happen in the future. This is an illusion. Social sciences are unable to predict. Nobody predicted the end of the Cold War, and nobody predicted the terrorist attacks of 9/11, for instance. International relations can hardly, and this is my point of view, should not tell decision makers, politicians, what to do or what not to do. for the very simple reason, ladies and gentlemen, that there are, as we saw throughout our survey, many theories of international relations. There are many contending theories of international relations, which means that none is likely to be true. And which means also that, by definition, the policymaker will listen to the theory that he or she somehow believes, has internalized as being valid. So the statesman, the policymaker, the decision maker is not likely to be influenced by theories that he or she disagrees with. So there can never be one single neutral advice given by the discipline of international relations. It will always be a political recommendation based on theoretical assumptions, be these assumptions more or less realist, more or less liberal, more or less neo-Marxist, more or less feminist, etc., etc. If then theories cannot predict, if they cannot and should not prescribe their use, for us, their utility consists in being cognitive guidelines, permitting to render our somehow internalized convictions in the domain of international relations, convictions of philosophical, of ideological, or of ethical nature. International relations theories permit these convictions to be more rigorous, to be based on rigorous concept, on empirical, that is to say, historical corroborations. And we should use these theoretical guidelines to make our own convictions more convincing. This should permit ourselves to be more convincing and also to be more tolerant, ladies and gentlemen, in our discussions, in our debates on international relations within a democratic, that is to say, within a pluralist society, based on mutual respect with those who have a different approach, and yet a valid and possibly relevant approach to better understand what is going on the world political scene. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening to today's lecture and also to all my lectures. I hope you enjoy them. I announce a new lecture for next year, precisely consisting in proposing an international relations analysis of Russia's war in Ukraine. Thank you very much once again. Goodbye, and hope to see you soon again.